all set whenever you are.
Okay, great. So my, I think I can, hold on a second. Do I have the ability to advance and go back to the slides? Oh yeah, okay, cool. Great, so my part of the presentation is sort of gonna be focused on the both the New York State historic tax credits as it relates to income properties, but also homeowner occupied properties, as well as the federal historic tax credits and where those two programs intersect for folks that might be taking on a project that includes a portion of the building that they live in and a portion of a building that they look to earn some rental income on. So just as a quick overview, to give you an idea of how well utilized the program is, this is sort of what the level of investment has been between 1977 and last year. That's 109 billion with a B for the amount of investment made in historic tax credit projects over that period of time. And New York State has consistently been the leader in not just the amount of projects that get through, but the money spent. And in the last 4 years, there's been over $4 billion spent for qualified expenses associated with rehabilitating historic buildings. The next closest state, I think, to us is Ohio, and they're only at like 2.3 billion. So we really blow it out of the water here in New York State. And also it's a huge job creator. One of the best things about the program, one of the many good things about the program is that it's one of the few government sponsored subsidy programs that actually puts money back into the system more so than it takes out, which is increasingly unfortunate when people forget that and they try to get rid of the program. But thankfully, to the efforts of folks like the Historic Albany Foundation and others, we've been able to successfully keep the program around. So let's start off with the historic homeowner tax credit. Qualified rehab expenditure, QRE, that's sort of most of the costs associated with rehabilitating a property: exterior work, interior work, plumbing, systems, roofing. If it's the envelope of the house or contained within it, for the most part, it's a qualified rehab expenditure. You won't earn tax credits. Qualified rehab expenditures do not extend to detached outbuildings like a garage, site work, or furniture and appliances. You know, if it doesn't really have to do with the historic property directly itself, it's not going to be an eligible expense. For the homeowner credit, it's sort of in the name, it has to be owner occupied. In order to access the program, you have to meet a minimum threshold requirement of spending at least $5,000 on eligible expenses, which for folks that own old buildings know that you can do that without batting an eye. And you have to spend 5% of your total project cost on the outside of the house because they like seeing that money on the outside and the impact of that. The two programs work a little bit differently in so much as that the homeowner tax credit for New York State, you have to get your scope of work approved by the State Historic Preservation Office before you start work. That's very important. So planning ahead with your applications is important because it's usually about a 30-day review process for the applications to go through to the state. So the sooner you can get that information to them, the better off you are. So you're not delaying your project or potentially losing out on tax credits. The maximum historic tax credit you can make on the homeowner program is $50,000, which means you're spending $250,000 on the rehab. And the nice thing about the program is that you can come back to it year after year. So if you don't want to or can't take on the entirety of your project in 1 year, but maybe you want to spread that over a couple years, you can keep coming back to the program as long as you're meeting those minimum requirements of spending $5,000, spending $5,000 outside of the building, and making it owner occupied. There's a 2-year recapture period, which basically means that if you finish your building in, say, 2022, don't sell it or transfer the ownership for 2 years, because otherwise you run the risk of the department capturing your tax credits. So hold on to it. Most folks, I'd imagine, would be, but that's something to keep in mind for the homeowner occupied program. Now moving on to the federal tax credit program for income producing properties, very similar. Again, you're going to earn 20% of your qualified expenses. Income producing can sort of be a variety of things, whether it's apartments, an office, mixed use. If the use in the building is generating money from rent, it's income producing. Pretty simple. Similar to the homeowner program, there is a recapture period. Here it's 5 years. Again, if you sell or transfer the property within 5 years of, quote, placing the building in service, i.e. finishing your project, ready for occupancy, you run the risk of losing your historic tax credits being clawed back by the government. There's no cap for the credits on the federal historic tax credit side of things. So if you've got a massive project, you're going to get all 20% of that back as long as you follow the rules and regulations. The federal credit works a little bit differently. You can carry it forward 20 years and you can look back 1 year. And the reason that is that individuals' federal tax liability for the year in which they complete their project might not be as substantial as the actual tax credit value. So that can roll forward. Although it's not noted here. Oh, actually it is noted here. I must have updated my slide. You have to take the tax credit from the feds over a period of 5 years. Prior to the 2017 tax changes, you could take it all in year one when you finished your project. But for them to make their goofy math work out when they messed around with the taxes, now you have to take it ratably over 5 years. The state credit you can take in year one. So the two programs are slightly different, which lends to some additional confusion. Similarly, New York State also has a companion income producing tax credit. This works similar to what you've already seen, 20% of qualified expenses. Property has to be located in the qualified census tract. You can see that I've got asterisks on those first 2 points. And the reason being is that there's some qualifiers to add to that, which we'll discuss in the next slide. If you have more New York State historic tax credits than you do tax liability, i.e. the money you owe the state in taxes, then depending on your individual circumstance, the difference can come back to you as a refund check, which is great. Instead of rolling forward until it runs out like the federal credit, you get money in the bank. There's a $5 million cap. Unlike the federal program, there is a cap to this, and you can carry the credits forward until they run out. You know, if it takes you more than 20 years, you're okay. It probably won't though. So here's some of the recent changes that actually pretty much just happened to the New York State historic tax credit. If you have what's known as, quote, a small project, which is still a lot of money, your small project, if your qualified expenses are $2.5 million or less, the New York State historic tax credit has been increased from 20% to 30%. And this is only for income producing properties. This is not an increase in the historic homeowner tax credit. It doesn't go back at all. So if you just finished a project that would be perfect for this, and you placed it in service, unfortunately, you're not going to see that increase in the credit. Your project has to have been completed, well, will have to have been completed by the 1st of next year or any time after that date to see that bump in the credit. The qualified census tract requirement. A qualified census tract is where the census tract in which a property is located, the average household income is at the state median average or below. It basically is their attempt to not further incentivize subsidy in wealthier neighborhoods, which makes sense. The change that's recently happened with the qualified census tract requirement is that it's not based on the individual census tract anymore. It's actually based on the poverty level of the municipality in which the property in census tract is located, which basically means to say most of New York State ends up being qualified census tracts, except for areas you'd expect, like New York City in most parts, most of Saratoga. But a lot of the state was previously qualified census tracts. The only thing that this change basically means is that a pretty good chunk of census tracts that would have been left out of the program and may have been completely surrounded on all 4 sides of eligible census tracts are now generally going to be eligible because it's based on the municipal poverty level, not the individual census tract. So you're able to access the historic tax credits in generally one of 2 ways. You either are a building that's in a National Register listed historic district, which is how most people are going to access the program for an individual home, or you're individually listed on the National Register. And for a house, whether it's a standalone single family home or a row house, it's pretty unlikely that that's an individual listing. A house really needs to be special to rise to the level of individual listing. So you'll find that if you're going to be into this program, it's probably because your property is in a historic district. And then there's one more caveat to that. There's also what's known as a local tax certified historic district, which means you're not on the National Register, but the IRS has basically stamped your historic district for certification, which means you can take advantage of the exact same tax credit benefits, the exact same process. You're just not on the National Register. So it gets you to the same end goal. It's just a different way of doing it. The homeowner application process, again, you need to get your application into the State Historic Preservation Office prior to the start of work. The folks at the SHPO are very helpful in this process. If things aren't clear or you have questions, you're trying to get something clarified before you submit your application, so you don't end up getting sort of bounced back and forth, you know, tit for tat, asking questions and clarifications throughout the process. You can give them a call and they will talk through a lot of this stuff with you. I think there are some groups locally in the capital region that will actually help with the application process. I'm sure the folks at Historic Albany Foundation can probably guide you in the right direction on that. It's a 3-part application process. This is sort of what the application looks like. It's a not very sexy bureaucratic document, but it gets you the information you need and more importantly that the state needs. Part 1 is basically confirmation of what your building status is as far as its historic designation goes, historic district or individual listing, which again, most likely it'll be in a historic district. Part 2 is where the majority of the work is going to go. And that is sort of what this second application looks like. Basically, you need to give them a visual walkthrough of your property with photo documentation for both the proposed work you want to do and once everything is said and done. So this is sort of what the part 2 looks like. You know, it's pretty simple. What are your photo numbers associated with the rooms you're talking about? What's a general description of what you're doing? What's the existing condition on site? What do you want to do to it? And what do you think it'll cost? So, you know, if we're looking at the first one, it'd be like photos 1 through 5, exterior work, you know, clapboard requires paint and scrape. Proposed work would say scrape and paint, repaint house, estimated cost $10,000 or whatever it's going to be. And then again, because most folks from the State Historic Preservation Office don't unfortunately have the time to come to individual site visits for the homeowner program just because they are so inundated. I mean, again, our state has processed $4 billion worth of investment in the last 4 years. So you can imagine the amount of paperwork that is. What they need you to do is visually walk them through your building with photos that are ideally sort of keyed to a general floor plan. It doesn't have to be an architect's drawing. If you've got one, great. If not, you can just sketch something, put some photo numbers in the direction of where you're taking those photos. And it's pretty easy to communicate to them in the application. Again, this is just sort of a summary of what you've already seen. The state homeowner credit, 20% of your eligible costs, got to be owner occupied, got to spend more than $5,000. State has to approve your work beforehand. The commercial credit, also known as the income producing credit, 20% from the state, 20% from the feds, an additional 10% from the state if your project is $2.5 million or less. So you might be upwards of 50% of your costs coming back. And we'll talk about what the adjusted basis is in the next slide, I think. Maybe the next one after this. So we've talked about the 3 individual programs, the homeowner occupied program, the state income producing program, and the federal income producing program. So now we're going to talk about how all that stuff can come together. So in a situation in which you are combining the historic homeowner occupied state historic tax credits and the income producing state and federal historic tax credits, these are some quick facts you need to know. All right. Your income producing credits, your commercial credits, are going to be the costs associated with the rental or income producing portion of your property. Pretty simple. Homeowner credits, obviously on the other side of that, costs associated with the portion of the property that you'll be living in. And shared costs like your exterior, so masonry repair, siding repair, windows, roofing, etc., that is split evenly between the homeowner credit and the income producing credit. And the thing to keep in mind is, and this is important, you would think that if your house is divided 50-50 from homeowner to owner occupied, that you would only need to spend over a certain amount at the 50% that's income producing. In reality, you have to spend over your adjusted basis on the entire property in order to make the income producing portion of the property eligible for the credit. So your adjusted basis is not on the next slide. Basically, your adjusted basis is what you paid for the property, plus improvements, if applicable, minus depreciation, if applicable, and minus land value. So what that basically means to say, if you bought a property yesterday for $10,000 and the land value is $1,500, so you're at $8,500. You've had no time to make improvements, so that's not relevant. You've just bought it yesterday, so depreciation isn't a factor. So for your $10,000 purchase, subbing out a $1,500 land value, your adjusted basis is $8,500. And that's the number you need to get over for eligible expenses in order to access the state and federal income producing tax credit. So here's just a little bit of a visual for a building type that most folks are probably familiar with, nice row house. Let's say you take the top floor, so you're in the upper 1/3, all the stuff that's going to happen inside that upper 1/3, well, I guess in this case, upper quarter, forgot the raised basement level, in that upper quarter, that's going to be eligible for just the state 20% historic homeowner tax credit. If the lower 3/4 is all income producing, whether it's one awesome 3-level apartment or 2 in 1 or 3 individuals, doesn't really matter. You're going to be seeing the state 20% from the income producing program and an additional 20% from the feds for their income producing program. And again, depending on the individual circumstance, if your project is under 2.5 million, that state credit's actually going to bump up to 30%. So you'll be sitting pretty with subsidy. And then again, exterior and shared spaces, you'll be splitting them between the homeowner and commercial equally. And I believe I've got a little metric that shows how that works coming up. So just to recap, things you need to know: is your building eligible, i.e. is it on the National Register in a local historic district that's tax certified, or in a historic district that's National Register listed? Does your rehab work qualify, meaning are you doing things to the building that are appropriate, that the state's going to sign off on? Generally, when it comes to historic buildings, don't try to reinvent the wheel. Work with the building, don't work against it. Do the rehab costs exceed your adjusted basis, which we already talked about? You've got to spend more on the rehabilitation than your adjusted basis in the building to earn those income producing tax credits from the state and the feds. And do you need tax credits, cash, or both? That's really not going to be a factor for most folks. We're not going to talk about selling your tax credits because that doesn't really happen at the scale of the projects that we're talking about here. So this is your substantial rehabilitation test. That's the technical IRS term for is my project going to get over the threshold requirements that the IRS has. So my eligible expenses have to exceed my adjusted basis. There's your calculation for what your adjusted basis is, which we've gone over. Most of your qualified expenses are going to be those that are associated with hard and soft costs. So if you're hiring an architect or a structural engineer, those are eligible expenses too. So you can count those towards earning your tax credits. Again, you're not going to earn tax credits on buying the place. You're not going to earn it on your driveway or your outbuildings or landscaping. And sort of the rule of thumb is buy low, rehab high. So if you have the luxury of buying a property that is in dire need of repair in a historic district, eligible for the credits, and you can take it on and you've got the resources to do it, then that's a pretty good project for the tax credit program. So here's sort of an example. All right, you buy a property for $50,000. Let's say your adjusted basis is $45,000, right? You bought it yesterday, no depreciation factored in, no improvements factored in, just land value. The land value is $5,000 in this scenario. You're going to have to spend $100,000 to rehab the property, and you're going to live in it 50-50. Half will be homeowner occupied, half will be income producing. And so this is sort of getting you to the point where you could see, right? Total project cost of $100,000. You take half of that towards your homeowner program times 20%. That's $10,000. Again, that might actually be refundable depending on your individual income status. The income producing portion will be as high as 50%, again, accounting for the recent increase in the state historic tax credit. So your total tax credit value after your $100,000 investment in the actual rehab work will be $35,000. So you'll see about a third of your cost back. One of the things to keep in mind, to add just more nuance on top of other nuance, is that the feds view the state tax credits as income. So you actually get taxed on your tax credits by the feds. So it's not a true 50%, but it's still pretty good. So you'll see a good chunk of your money back. Like count on about a third, and that's conservative. So as you can imagine, they don't make up all of these rules and regulations to not then have more rules and regulations. So there's a lot of great documentation out there that the National Park Service has put out, preservation briefs, preservation bulletins. There's sort of, some are in-depth, some are more topical, more visual heavy examples on basically certain treatments or certain building types and what to do and what not to do. These are great reference materials depending on your individual project. A lot of this stuff is more geared towards bigger buildings, but there are documents out there that are geared towards your typical projects like row houses, for example. So there's 10 standards. We're not going to go through all of them. We'll go through a couple with some topical examples. So the first standard basically is summarized as, if you're not going to be using the property for its original use, try not to reinvent the wheel for a new use. So if you have a single family home and you want to make it multiple units or partly single, partly multiple family, that's fine. Again, just try to work with the building instead of against it. Keeping historic features like mantelpieces, layouts. We can play around with layouts. There's not a lot of flexibility, but certainly in like basements or attics where there's less historic fabric, or if your entire floor plan's been completely blown out by the person before you, there's really not much to worry about for historic fabric. So you can sort of do a little bit of what you want there, more so than if you walked in the front door and the place was pretty much intact to how it was built. This is sort of an example of a blown out row house. I mean, all the double parlor configuration's gone. You can see the two fireplaces on the left-hand side. There would have been a wall splitting those into a front and rear parlor. Place was completely gutted, bombed out, just perimeter walls, mantelpieces, and a stair. So this is the apartment plan that was developed for it. Those double parlors sort of still stayed one big combined parlor. That was okay. Open kitchen living. And then we made some division towards the back of the house where there were less historic finishes and details for 2 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. This is one of my favorite projects because who wouldn't want this bathtub? It's great. It's an old Oriole off the side of that same row house you just saw. Awesome. I'm very jealous of whoever lives here. And that's a good example of working with the building instead of against it. So here's some before and after photos of one of the same properties. You walk into this and you're like, what the hell am I going to do to save what I can here? So unfortunately, because of the deterioration, some elements were able to stay, some had to be replicated, like the window casings you can see, they're a little bit different, but they're still relatively period appropriate. The chimney breast on the right-hand side maintains some semblance of a mantelpiece, although not the original one. And then these great curved doors leading into an oriole on the back corner of the building were kept and refinished. So again, golden rule, work with what you got if it's historic fabric and try to fix it. Fourth standard, changes over time gain their own significance, which means to say that if you have an 1820 row house and then somebody, 1820 or whatever, Greek Revival row house, and then somebody came through and did an Italianate remodel to keep up with the Joneses, 40 plus years later, generally you don't scrape off that Italianate era stuff and go back to the Greek Revival. You got to work with what you've got. This is actually a project in Troy. This is an example of a not great change over time where they scraped off a 3-story Oriole and put vinyl over the brick and covered up the cornice. And then we, based on that historic photo, took all that garbage off and then reconstructed the 3-story Oriole as faithfully as we could. Fifth standard, distinctive features. Basically, again, this falls under that sort of golden rule, work with what you've got. It might be obvious to folks that if you've got quarter sawn oak trim and 24 karat gilded wall paneling, that you wouldn't paint that stuff or throw it out, but you might be surprised how many people try or think that's a good idea. So again, trying to identify and working to identify what makes your property significant if historic fabric is still present, and working to keep that to the highest degree possible is the way to go. If your place has been battered over the years, which many places have been, what you need to do is that if you cannot repair the historic fabric because either it's too far gone or missing completely, if you want to start returning features that are gone, that's your prerogative. It's not necessarily required. Here's an example of a mansion house we did. We had a little bit of remnant here and there to understand just enough of what was missing to put back right things like the casing in the top left corner, or the wainscoting that wrapped the perimeter of this music room. You can just barely see the shadow lines of the design of the wainscoting that was removed. And same thing here, this mantelpiece of the fireplace that went away. You see where the baseboard was cut. You see some ghost lines on the hearth there, so you get some sense of what the mantelpiece looked like. Trying to work with the clues that are left, if you really want to do something authentic, is a great way to put a place back together again. Windows are probably the biggest repair or replace topic. I am a pragmatic preservationist, but I am a huge fan of original windows, and I will never buy into the argument that new replacement windows can be more efficient, because there are so many studies that show that a properly restored sash with appropriate weather stripping and either an interior or exterior storm window can come pretty darn close to your replacement double glazed windows. So the photo on the top left, that's sort of an example of a window that we're probably not going to be keeping. But if you've got your original windows and they're in good repair, it's going to be beneficial for you in the long run to either have them fixed up or fix them up yourself, because they will last you longer than any replacement window, no matter what the Anderson salesman says when they come door to door. One of the other standards, gentlest means possible, is basically the takeaway from here. If you've got brick and it's painted and it wasn't painted historically, because some of these were painted historically, you can remove it, but just don't do things that are going to damage the building irreversibly, like sandblasting. I know there are certain types of brick that can actually withstand sandblasting. Usually that's not most buildings. So using means like low pressure washes and appropriate detergents and cleaners for masonry buildings. Here's an example sort of in the bottom, a before and after of a test patch we did to determine how impactful the products we were using to remove the paint may or may not be for the brick before we went whole hog into the rest of the building, just to play it safe. So doing these types of things in nondescript areas is always a smart move. And that is the speed run of that presentation.
From the audience for Mike, I can feed them back to him if you like. No questions. Do we have any more questions on Zoom? I don't think so. No questions on Zoom. Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Mike. That was great.
Sure.
Always enjoy seeing projects or pictures of rehab projects.
That's the best part.
I know, right? We do have materials for the tax credits in the back. Shippo wasn't able to attend tonight, but we do have applications and information about both the homeowner and income producing credits. So if you're interested, they're back by Katie at check-in. So be sure to grab some. They'll also be online for anyone who's virtual. They'll be